how a knitting project that began in prison grew into a global movement for Nelson Mandela. On this centennial of Nelson Mandela's birth, a conversation with the anti-apartheid legend's grandson, Ndaba Mandela, about furthering his grandfather's legacy, and how social media bots became an influential force in Africa's elections. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Vincent McCory. This is Africa 54. We'll have all those stories in a moment, but first, the skies are once again friendly between Ethiopia and Eritrea. The first commercial flight in 20 years from Ethiopia to Eritrea landed in the Eritrean capital, the latest sign of normalized ties between the longtime foes. The flight is the latest chapter in a new and fast-moving chapter of improved relations between the two countries that began when Ethiopia's new reformist Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced in June that Addis Ababa would finally honor a deal signed in 2000 to end a two-year border war that killed an estimated 70,000 people. Passengers on the flight included former Ethiopian Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn, who led the travelers off the plane onto a red carpet at the Asmara airport. VOA reporter Tawelde Desfa Gabir was at the airport in Asmara and described the scene.
It was very exciting. Earlier on in the morning, residents of the capital, Asmara, showed up at the airport, decorated with traditional dresses, holding banners, flags of Ethiopia and Eritrea, singing the traditional song. Then, just before noon, the first plane just arrived. The former Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Haile Mariam Desalegn, embarked along with the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines, and this group were welcomed. This group was welcomed by Eritrean Foreign Minister Osman Saleh and Eritrean Airlines officials.
Now, you were talking to people there at the airport. What were people saying?
We are more than happy. We have no words. Very happy to be here, and everybody was thanking God. A dream came true.
Will the flights be daily, or do you know the schedule for the flights?
And the short plan, as far as the plan, is going to be daily. I was also told that there is nothing like a permanent schedule for now, but tomorrow another plane is coming, and guests from Eritrea also traveling back to Ethiopia. They have done the same today. Today, the second plane that was carrying ordinary guests flew back to Ethiopia.
Well, earlier this month, Ahmed and Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki signed a historic peace deal that formally ended one of Africa's longest, most intractable conflicts. The two nations have since restored telephone lines, and Eritrea has reopened its embassy in Addis Ababa on Monday. Eritrea was a former province of Ethiopia until breaking away and declaring its independence in 1993. Now, July the 18th marks the centenary of the birth of Nelson Mandela. Every year on this day, people around the world are asked to continue his life's work through acts of kindness. Mandela Day events are being held in South Africa and in other countries to celebrate the legacy of the anti-apartheid icon. On Tuesday, former U.S. President Barack Obama delivered the 2018 annual Mandela Lecture in Johannesburg. He painted a grim picture of global events, but tempered it by saying he believes in Mandela's vision of equality, justice, and freedom. It was a royal affair in the United Kingdom as Prince Harry and his new wife, Meghan Markle, visited an exhibition in honor of Mandela. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex met Mandela's friends and family. The Mandela exhibition has been shown in various forms around the world, including 6 weeks at the Paris Town Hall. As the world remembers the birth of Mandela, some have wondered the extent to which his legacy is helping shape and influence South Africa as it strives to become a more pluralistic democracy. For some perspective, I'm joined in studio by Paul Nantolia, a political analyst and researcher at the National Defense University's Africa Center for Strategic Studies. He worked with the African National Congress in South Africa. Paul, welcome back to Africa 54.
Thank you, Vincent. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Wow, a day that we're thinking about a man who captured the imagination of everybody in the world.
Indeed.
Here's a question. As you observe this day, you were very close to where he was very influential in South Africa and within the African National Congress. How was his influence felt, or at least manifested through the party?
Yes, in a number of ways. And I think one of the most critical issues is that he modeled a leadership style that became part and parcel of the principles of leadership that the ANC adheres to. One of those, of course, is political honesty. And you would recall shortly after his release, he visited New York to address a gathering there. And he narrated an experience. You know, in the 1960s, the African National Congress was looking for countries that could offer them bases and offer them support, diplomatic support, military support as well. And one of the countries they approached was Libya. And it was a very, very desperate time. They really needed that support. And they wanted to open an office in Libya. And they, right off the bat, informed the Libyan government that they had Jewish people, you know, they had Jews who were playing a very important role in their military structures as well as their political structures at a very high level. And they said, listen, you have to take us as we are. Yeah. We're working with the Jews. And because of that, the Libyans refused to open, they refused that request. And they actually placed conditions on the ANC and said, listen, you've got to sever these ties. And the ANC said, no, you know, you've got to accept us as we are. The same principle was applied with Sinn Féin. The ANC had relations with Sinn Féin, but also had a relationship with the British government, and were honest enough to tell both sides that, listen, you know, we have these relationships. So it was a principle of honesty. When he was in New York, he said that, you know, anybody who shifts and changes his position based on the person that he's talking to at the moment does not qualify to be a leader. And that was a critical principle of the ANC.
And this was a very strong man with that kind of a principle. But looking at what has been going on inside the ANC in the last several years, have the men and women in the ANC actually upheld those principles? Do we see that level of honesty, that level of, you know, sincerity, even when it comes to serving the citizens of South Africa?
Right. I mean, I think this is one of the biggest battles facing the ANC because, I mean, essentially the party is sort of gravitating in between sort of the Mandela generation, you know, the Robben Island generation, and the generation that came after, you know, the Thabo Mbeki, Tokyo Sexwale, Cyril Ramaphosa, you know, Kada Asmal and others. You know, there's that generation of leadership. But then you also have another you know, incoming sort of a younger echelon of leadership in the country that is kind of being perceived as not holding true to those principles. So it's an ongoing battle in the ANC. But one would say that those principles that Mandela, people like Oliver Tambo and his colleagues, Walter Sisulu, the principles that they embodied, you know, still have a constituency within the ANC. And I think this is one of the issues that we see playing out right now in the country.
One of the things I heard Mandela said, I thought it was very admirable, is that he did not want to be considered a saint.
Right.
And what did that translate into? I mean, what are people to understand about him that, you know, in his honesty makes him not be a saint?
Right. I mean, Mandela was one of the first people who said that he did not want to be lionized. Actually, one of the, you know, there are quite a number of things that a lot of, you know, members of your audience might not be aware of. He actually refused to be a nominee for the president of the country, you know, while the negotiations were being conducted to end apartheid. But that was a collective decision that was taken. He felt that Oliver Tambo needed to take over the leadership. But his colleagues said, listen, I mean, for historical reasons, you would be better placed to actually take the organization forward. However, at that particular Congress, he undertook to only serving one term. He didn't need to, but he undertook to serving only one term. Wow. So I mean, he was really honest to that level.
Indeed, it was an extraordinary man. Thank you very much, Paul, for joining us today.
Thank you.
To share There's perspectives with that. That is Paul Nantolia, who is a political analyst, is a researcher also at the National Defense University's Africa Center for Strategic Studies. Now, this week we have been featuring ordinary people who are honoring the life and legacy of Nelson Mandela by taking his lessons into their hearts and communities. In the last of a three-part series, Africa 54's Heidi Adams Fitzpatrick brings us the story of a global movement that began with a single stitch and why there are now more knitters in South African prisons than ever before.
On his 90th birthday, Nelson Mandela said it's time for new hands to continue his struggle for social justice. His foundation urged every person around the world to spend 67 minutes a year doing something for someone else. That's 1 minute for each year of Mandela's life as an activist. Well, that call to action has now taken root in a global movement of women and men making a difference in an unusual way, using needles and yarn. Veronica Busby is a nitwit and proud of it. The South African native, along with her band of knitters and crocheters, are on a mission to create dozens of blankets for the poor and homeless. It's Sunday morning after church. Women congregate at a Washington restaurant for another special meeting. Stitching for Nelson Mandela.
We've truly gone out of our way to reach out to all members of society, and we've been embraced by all of them from all over the country: Atlanta, Nevada, California, Florida. All these states mail their work up to me, and I join all the squares into blankets, and then we choose local charities that we give it to. This charity is truly about giving your time, because you're creating something from nothing for no return other than to make your neighbors feel loved and warm.
The 67 Blankets for Mandela Day movement began in South Africa 5 years ago with the help of prisoners. The brainchild of this woman, Carolyn Steyn. She believed inmates could be rehabilitated by following the example of the world's most famous political prisoner. Serve others while serving a sentence. Soon the public was hooked. Knitathons are now popular around the country and the world. This year, nitwits from South Africa and elsewhere helped knit and crochet a centennial Mandela masterpiece. The world's largest portrait blanket depicting Mandela's face. From the skies over Pretoria, a reminder that the anti-apartheid hero still looms large. In America, Mandela's life of service and sacrifice weaves a familiar story.
As an African American, we know that perseverance is very important to our community, just for the different things that we've encountered here in this country. So perseverance is important, and he showed 27 years he was in prison, and he still came out and served again, and served until he died. If he can do it, we can do something in our community to make it better.
At these knitathons, young Americans get a crash course on Mandela.
I crochet everywhere I go, and people ask me, and I say it's 67 blankets for Nelson Mandela. Oh, the young people ask who, and I bend their ears and tell them, and they go away with a little more knowledge.
The nitwits believe when people know more, they're likely to do more. They say creating change is much like creating a blanket. The pattern is simple. Start small, build on that foundation, and keep going one stitch at a time until you've made a much-needed blanket that could change someone's life.
It is time for new hands to lift the burdens. It is in your hands now I thank you.
With blanket contributions coming from Asia, the United States and Australia, as well as the blankets handmade by South Africans, the Knitwits have stitched their way into the Guinness Book of World Records.
While Daba Mandela, a grandson of Nelson Mandela, continues to carry Nelson's message of peace, justice and solidarity. Now, fueling the Nobel laureate's vision that one person can make a difference. Africa 54's Lenore Madu sat down with Daba, who is an author, founder and chairman of the Africa Rising Foundation. He's also a UN AIDS Global Ambassador.
Daba Mandela, welcome to the Voice of America.
Thank you very much.
When I say Nelson Mandela, give me 3 words.
Grandfather, courageous, fearless.
Can you elaborate a little more?
Courageous and fearless, obviously they go together. But, I mean, that is the man who went against the system, who sacrificed his family, sacrificed his own life for the greater good of his people. So for me, even when they isolated him in his later years as an old man to try and get him to denounce his political party and his fellow comrades, and they tried to, you know, persuade him with luxury and all kinds of things, he never waned. He always stayed focused on the dream that was at hand.
Nelson Mandela was one of the most visionary and influential political figures that the world has seen. You are his grandson, and you were the first child to grow up under his roof after he came out of prison. What was it like?
A bit overwhelming because I come from, you know, I was growing up in the ghetto with my parents, and it was a broken home by any standards. You know, moving into this big house with security, drivers, so many staff, and the only 2 people that were really it was me and him, and then my cousin Rochelle. Me and my grandfather really didn't talk much. The only conversation we had was really, it revolved around my education, what I needed for school, and how was my report card, and the occasional scolding if my room was in a mess.
Interesting, because in your book, Going to the Mountain, I read about the time when he kicked you out because you lost, for the second time, you lost your jersey.
Yes.
That was an example of the type of disciplinarian he was, right?
Exactly. You know, you think it is harsh, but he actually never let me sleep outside.
Yes.
But he made sure that, you know, he was serious. So he kind of exiled me outside until it got dark, basically. Yes. And, you know, as harsh as it was, I never lost a jersey, so it was a very effective method.
The title of the book is Going to the Mountain, and it's a rite of passage for young men in your tribe.
Yes, that's
now,
right.
Something that I found interesting was the fact that you write in the book, your grandfather showed you that no ritual could make a boy a man. What do you mean by that?
Well, basically, you know, there's a point where I didn't perform well at school. And my grandfather stopped me going to the bush. He is a person that really values education.
Absolutely.
Because it was something that was stripped away from them.
Yes.
And even the college and the schools they went to, they were not on the same level as the schools that were being attended by white kids. You understand? So that for him was a sort of a measuring litmus test to see whether you're ready to become a man or not, whether you are taking care of your responsibilities or not.
Yes.
And that can be judged from a young age. You don't have to wait to an adult.
And education was very important to him.
It was so important that he sent my parents to university at the age of 45 and decided to take me in because he felt that it doesn't matter how old you are, you need education. And that was 4 or 5 years after Nelson Mandela came out of prison. And he always said that it's important for you to get a degree. I didn't know what degree, and he never ever pushed me to say, I want you to study politics or law or, you know, civil rights or anything like that. He just said, you need to have a degree. That is the most important thing.
Listen, there is an entire young generation of South Africans and even youth around the world that were born after Mandela came out of prison. they may not really understand the role that he played in the struggle. To what extent do you see them relating to his legacy?
That is the very reason why I wrote this book. I actually wanted young people to be able to see Nelson Mandela not as this huge, great icon and this president of a country, but as a grandfather. Because young people can all relate to having a grandparent. You know, lessons from my grandfather. And that way, you know, I purposefully targeted the younger audience because I want the younger audience to understand the intrinsic value of Nelson Mandela and why is he important for the world. And of course, it's a 100-year celebration. Absolutely. And this is my way of paying tribute to a great leader, but my granddad.
And 100 years, indeed, in July marks the birthday. So what do you see as the common legacy that people should take from his life, or perhaps that people are taking on their daily lives?
This is the first and foremost thing that they should take from Nelson Mandela, is what kind of leader was he? He was a man with a vision. He was a man who was dedicated and believed in his cause. A man who had integrity, humility. A man who dived into public service. A leader is there to understand his constituency and serve them the best way he can. You are there to be the voice and the face of those who cannot talk for themselves or act for themselves. That is what we must take away from this. Nelson Mandela, the leader. What kind of leadership? These are the characteristics that are important to be a leader.
Well, answering his grandfather's call to making a difference, Ndaba Mandela elaborates on his work and various endeavors in Thursday's part 2 of his discussion with Lino Madu, including his Africa Rising Foundation and his engagement as a UNAIDS Global Ambassador. We want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we covered. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. We're also streaming our show live on Facebook, so check us out and share our show with your friends. Find me on Twitter at VOA Vince McCory. Still ahead on Africa 54, who shaped African Twitter conversations during elections over the past year. But first, a look at Wednesday's headlines.
In Libya, the Coast Guard is denying accusations by a Spanish aid group that it left 2 women and a child to die in the Mediterranean Sea. In South Africa, former U.S. President Barack Obama hosts a 5-day leadership course during a Johannesburg town hall attended by 200 young innovators selected from across Africa. In South Sudan, a teacher training college is open in Yambio to educate young people in a country where at least 1.4 million children have been forced out of school by conflict. Ethiopian Airlines launched the first 2 commercial flights to Eritrea in 2 decades, following a series of peaceful actions that marked the end of a 20-year conflict. Finally, in Kenya, another rhino dies after being moved to populate the newly created Tsavo East National Park, leaving only 2 alive out of the original 11.
Well, on Wednesday, July the 18th, Portland Communications will released its 4th How Africa Tweets study. This year's study analyzed thousands of Twitter handles to determine the location and profession of the most influential voices driving Twitter conversations during 10 recent African elections. A key finding from the report is that bots and accounts displaying machine-like behavior were active across all the elections. In Kenya, bots accounted for 25% of influential voices. Rwanda was the opposite, with bots accounting for just 4% of influential voices. Across all elections, bots serve primarily to agitate, pushing negative narratives about major issues, candidates, and perceived electoral abnormalities. Now, following the elections, many bots had the elections content removed, with some turning their attention to discussions outside Africa. For more on How Africa Tweets reports, Robert Watkinson, Portland's Africa partner, joins me live via Skype from London. Good evening, Robert.
Good evening, Vincent.
So if you can briefly just give us a little background to this, what led your curiosity into this direction?
Thank you. Yes, as you say, this is our 4th study, How Africa Tweets, looking at how Twitter is used on the continent. And Some of the previous studies have looked at the volume of tweets, languages used, the time of day that people tweet. But this year we decided to interrogate an area that hadn't been looked at before by anyone, as far as we understand, which is how Twitter is being used around elections in Africa.
And then we look at the level to which it influenced, for example, Kenyan elections. Talk about 25%. Why would that be the case in Kenya? Who was tweeting? Who are people paying attention to?
Well, let me just take you back up a step and tell you a little bit more about the overall key findings of the report, if I may, before talking specifically about Kenya, because as you say, Kenya is a particularly interesting example. But obviously across 9 different countries and 10 elections, there were 2 elections in Kenya during the period in question. You're talking about a very varied landscape. But we did identify some key findings which seem to exist across the board. The first is the prevalence of external voices. We found that about 53% on average across the elections of the most influential voices on Twitter around election campaigns were actually outside the countries in question. And when we dug deeper into that finding, we realized that actually about half of those influential voices were outside the continent itself. The second key finding, which I think is particularly interesting, is the influence of politicians and political parties during campaigns. We expected that to be quite high, but on average we found actually that political voices account for about 10% of the influential tweeters during election campaigns. There are obviously anomalies, and in some cases, particularly in Rwanda, for example, we found political voices to be predominant. And then just to your third point, the third key finding, and the prevalence of bots. Yes, we found bots or accounts displaying machine-like behavior to be prevalent right across elections in Africa. Yeah. Yes. Sorry.
If you can quickly just compare and contrast the Kenya and Rwanda study in just about less than a minute.
Yes, of course. So interesting to think about Kenya and Rwanda, 2 East African countries, although, of course, 2 countries with very different sizes of economy, very different media environments, and indeed very different populations, Kenya having about 50 million people compared to Rwanda's 12. What things that we found were different were the prevalence of bots in the Kenyan election campaigns. Bots accounted for about 25% of the most influential voices, whereas in Rwanda, they were around 4%. We also found that domestic voices were probably about the same in Kenya and Rwanda at around 75%. So there is a real contrast there between the activity of bots in Rwanda and Kenya.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Robert, for joining us. We'll probably continue this conversation another time. That is Robert Watkinson of Portland Communications, and that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com for more news. Tune in to VOA's evening radio show, Africa News Tonight, at 1800 UTC. And in the mornings to Daybreak Africa between 0300 and 0600 UTC, Monday through Friday. Thanks a lot for watching from all of us in Washington. I want to wish you a very good night.
Welcome to English in a Minute. Lots of items are made from gold, like jewelry, coins, and medals.
Golden opportunity.
This sounds like a strange thing to be made of gold.
Jonathan, are you as excited as I am about the holiday next week?
I might be more excited. The holiday is a golden opportunity for me to catch